You may begin, sir.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to another really fun deep dive into cheese. I was saying earlier, and I'm sure some of you heard it, I'm super excited to do tonight's tasting. And we did the first set of deep dives with our AGC series, our Alpine Goudas and Cheddars. And we kind of thought to ourselves as we're deciding on new classes, the fun need not stop at those three cheeses. There's so many different categories that we can look at. And so today is soft cheese, and Brie being the kind of main lens we'll think about it, but I'm going to define a lot of terms for you tonight. We're going to have a fun time. We have our usual cast of characters, Benji emceeing, the monger behind the monger, or mongers, and then myself hosting, and then we have Will in the text, and he'll maybe stop in and give some clarification here and there. And we have a special guest today. We have Sam from Zingerman's Creamery. Sam, see if you can say hi. We're going to pass you the screen for a second.
Hi guys. So I'm Sam. As Zach just mentioned, I work at Zingerman's Creamery. I'm one of the cheesemakers, and I'm here because you guys are going to be tasting one of our cheeses tonight. That's going to be the goat brie that I believe is near the beginning of the lineup. But yeah. So I'm going to share some thoughts about cheese. I love cheese. I'm from Wisconsin, so I the land of beer and cheese, and I guess I actually did I did an undergrad in food science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then afterwards I did some studies in France for a larger cheese company, and it was like an internship with a larger cheese company, so I got some experience working with more industrial cheese. And then just recently I moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan to work with Zingerman's Creamery because I wanted to get a better view into the look of artisanal cheese making, which has been I think it's been a great place to do it at Zingerman's Creamery. So yeah, looking forward to sharing a little bit of my thoughts on the Bries tonight with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here, and feel free to stick around as long as you want. It's always nice to have somebody with a different background than our own, who can help with the tough dairy science questions.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, again, I love talking cheese, so I'll probably be here for a good portion tonight.
Good. And friends, I always like to just give you a little sense of what's to come, so you know how to kind of plan your night. We're going to talk about wine early on. So if somebody only wants to open one bottle, I'll talk about both so we can figure out what we're doing there. We're going to go cheese by cheese by cheese, but you also have crackers and jam. And tonight we're really going to talk about how flavors change when we introduce other things. So once you've introduced to a cheese and tried it on its own, I encourage you to mix and match and try all the different combinations you can come up with. And don't wait on me to introduce a cheese. For those of you who've been through this before, I like to talk, and we have extra special people talking tonight. And so if we're stuck on goat brie and all you want to do is try the harbison, just make sure you leave enough that when we get there, you're not looking at an empty spot and really upset when we're talking about it. So that's my only word of warning. Yeah, we're going to have a fun time tonight. Does anybody have any early questions before we jump right into the wine knowledge?
You are good to go.
Woo, cool. We have two really cool wines today. And as I was thinking about a brie tasting, I kind of thought about when it comes to really creamy cheeses, I think of two moves you have to make, and I made both of them in the two tastings. So acid is the first idea, right? We've talked about contrasting versus complementary flavors a lot on these tastings. So that's the classic contrasting flavors, right? High acid wine, really buttery cheeses. So that's what we're going to see a lot within the white wine. And the white wine is a cool story of two friends from two different places expressing a shared love of a totally different place. And so a lot of different geography going on. You have somebody from Michigan and a Frenchman, right? And they started a winery in California that's tipping its hat to Alsace in France, right? A lot of different things, a lot of different thoughts, but they do it with such passion and love. It's really apparent in their wine. I think it's really beautiful wine. And so Riesling, kind of a classic grape, known for an incredible amount of complexity. And we tend to see it more sweetly expressed, but there's plenty of Quebec style dry Rieslings, and Alsace is known for that idea. And so this is a beautiful, crisp white wine with so much on the nose, which I really love when you get melon and stone fruit and all this expressive nose, but you still get a bone dry wine. And so we're going to play with acid and how it relates to all these cheeses. And then with the Lambrusco, we're going to talk about bubbles. Bubbles is the other way to kind of contrast and clean up the palate as we're getting assaulted by delicious butterfat tonight. And the Lambrusco is coming from a family that's been doing it for a really long time, making wine in Emilia Romagna. And they make a beautiful Lambrusco. They've been doing it for over a century. It's a region, as we might remember from other tastings, known for Parmigiano Reggiano, as well as the Parma ham. And so there's a lot of food going on, right? And there's a lot of very serious food. And I always think of Lambrusco as kind of like it's a great way to start a night, right? It's not the most serious wine that comes out of this region, but it's a great way to start the night. It's a great way to go between courses because of those scrubbing bubbles. And so we're going to have two kind of ways to attack pairing with soft cheeses and talk about all of these different ideas throughout. And I'll weave in and out of the wines as we taste. So let's start talking about cheese. And before we jump right into the Robiola, I want to just define a handful of terms really quick. And Sam, feel free to jump in if you have other definitions on a more technical level, but it's please Brie mine. And so you might be thinking you're staring at 4 Bries. And I think that would be, it'd be incorrect in a couple ways, but it's important to understand why, right? You can say whatever you want when you come into the cheese counter and you say, I want a Brie. Our job is to figure out what you meant by that. And so it's not incorrect in a everyday usage of the term, but there's a lot of different technical terms and how they're applied to the consumer versus the cheesemaker versus the monger are different. So Brie in its most strict definition is AOC cheese, right? A cheese that has defined rules, and it's usually Brie de Meaux you hear about the most, and Meaux is a city slightly north, but mostly east of Paris. And a Brie would be usually, I believe, a 2 kilogram cheese, about that tall, and it's going to be made of raw milk, right? Those are the rules. So if I made a Brie any way outside of that, it certainly couldn't be called Brie de Meaux. And in some definitions, it wouldn't be even considered a Brie. So Zingerman's is making a beautiful Brie-style cheese. And I think, and we'll hear more from Sam, that it's truer to a Brie style than the Robiola or the triple cream or the Harbison. It's just not the right diameter, and it's not raw milk, and it's not cow's milk, but it's the right fat content and style. And so what these all have in common is a bloomy rind. And that's where we get tripped up as consumers, right? They all have a rind that is kind of fluffy, a little white, maybe a little yellow, a little geotrichum back, but it has bloomy on top of that. And so you guys, for the first cheese, have Robiola Bocina. Robiola Bocina is a beautiful cheese from Alta Longa. I have a cheese also from that creamery. Their cheeses are really cool, and they're a creamery that does everything incredibly well. They're very into state-of-the-art facility, the best air quality, the best this and that. And so there's a consistent kind of thumbprint through their cheeses. And what they're really focusing on is small format regional Italian cheeses, and they're in the Piedmont. So for the Bocina, the one you guys have, it's a blend of sheep and cow. The one I have just gets a little goat in there. And please go ahead and dive into it. I think you'll see each animal has its kind of note that you can detect. And it's a really beautiful cheese. In a tasting earlier from the week, one of the people we were tasting with talked about how, there's the 5 sense, or the 5 things we can taste: salt, acid, fat, bitter, sweet, and umami. And the thing that is now in debate is, can you taste fat? Does fat get captured by one of these? So some people argue there's a 6th taste: lipids and fat. And I think tonight we're really going to explore if that exists. Just a beautiful, beautiful cheese. So Robiolas is a term that you hear in Italy almost exclusively, right? It's in Italy, if I went to the counter and asked for a Brie, they would giggle a little bit at us. But if I want a soft cheese that's of this style, I'm going to ask for a Robiola. Robiolas, the big difference is, I mentioned a word, geotrichum. It has most often this layer of a different mold before it gets to the bloomy rind. And so most of the cheeses this company makes are different Robiolas. But they do have a handful of times that they're experimenting and bringing in this term Brie or Camembert, the other term we'll hear tonight. And so they make a water buffalo Camembert that's really lovely. but they're really focused on these regional different roviolas. I'm a big fan of Alta Longa, and we kind of rotate through different cheeses. And one you might have heard of before is La Tour. La Tour is probably their most famous cheese. And so you maybe have tried an Alta Longa cheese without even knowing it. What do people think so far of that cheese? Good. Okay. I see chewing, which is always a good thing.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the second cheese, because I think once we have two cheeses, we can start talking about how the wine affects it. And Sam's going to offer us a view of this cheese that I can't really offer of our cheeses. So quickly to introduce it, we're going to talk about this really beautiful goat brie. And this cheese is one of the newest cheeses coming out of Zingerman's.
Sam, I think you have a little feedback. If you want to turn your volume down or put headphones on.
Thank you, Brett. Awesome.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Cool. And so the goat milk camembert is delicious, or goat milk brie, sorry about that. And I've been working with Zingerman's, as many of you know, for most of my cheese career, so 10 plus years. And it's been really fun to see the creamery grow and change, and it has some really fun new energy right now at the creamery. Aaron, who just bought the creamery, is an amazing entrepreneur and has a family dairy background, and he comes from the family they were sourcing their cow's milk from. And they were really lucky enough to have Jules there for a while, Jules Mons. And Mons is a really famous cheese family in France, and he was on an internship. And so they've developed these amazing new cheeses. They have a classic mini brie and the goat brie. And I, quite frankly, have been slightly obsessed. I've used one of those two cheeses in like 3 of my tastings this week. And I kind of can't get enough. I rarely open a cheese and just sit there and eat the whole cheese. I eat a lot of cheese, as many of you know, but I eat like a little bite here and there. The first time I took one of these home, I sat there and ate the whole thing. So I hope you guys enjoy it tonight. And Sam, can you tell us a little bit about, your experience? I don't know if you were there during the development, but maybe a little bit how this cheese came to exist, and maybe a little bit about how it's made and how it's special. I know that we don't all have a dairy background, but I think something we've talked a lot about in this classes is like, we all can picture a cup of yogurt. So we all know what a curd is, and we all know what whey is. And we know that cheese is getting as much whey out of the curd to get to a cheese. So we have that stuff down. If you can give us a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think I could keep it pretty simple. But again, I'll keep my eye on the chat if there's any questions on things that I mentioned. But yeah, so I think Zach gave it a great intro. I always love it because people often do say that they can eat one of these size bries in one serving, which it is such a perfect little, it's very deceivingly small. It makes you think that it's like a one serving cheese. So it's definitely not. Zach wouldn't be the only one to finish it with one meal. But so I guess just going back to the very beginning, at Zingerman's Creamery, we made we always, with our aged cheeses, we always did like a soft rind cheese, but we never were able to make a brie just because typically there's a lot more equipment, and there's some different production, different ways to produce it than the cheese that we typically made. So it was always something that we always wanted to do, but it was just we didn't really have the experience or someone to introduce that cheese to the creamery. So when Jules came to the creamery in November of 2019, that was sort of a project that he took on, and just because we figured it'd be awesome to have a brie of our own, just because a brie is such a crowd-pleasing cheese that it's kind of hard to turn down, and so we figured it'd be the perfect item to introduce to the lineup. And so we started with the cow's milk cheese. We started working with that, I would say, in early January, early February, and we probably released it around March or April. And it was tough because the beginning batches were were batches that we made with the cheese just based on the tools that we already had on hand. And so like a lot of times we had to use very rudimentary tools like rather than a nice fancy vat or a fancy knife to cut the curd, we would have to use like a bucket and an old knife that was meant for cutting something else. Or so we had to use the tools that we had on hand until we were able to sort of perfect the recipe and the formula. But now since we've been able to build a customer base for the cheese, we've been able to invest in proper equipment, and now we can continuously make a consistent flavor profile for the Brie, which is nice. But so then since we kind of stabilized the cow's milk Brie, we thought, well, we also receive goat's milk, so why not do the same with the goats? Why not make a goat's milk Brie? And so pretty much the goat's milk Brie is not it's nearly the same cheese as the cow's milk Brie, but it's just got a couple different cultures that we use. So one thing you'll notice is that like Zach mentioned with the Robiola, there is some geocultures in there, which gives the cheese like a nice sort of thicker, wrinkly rind. And then the PC is what gives it that nice white, bloomy finish. So we have a little bit of geo, but it's still mostly the PC, which keeps it consistent with the Brie. But it's cool because we added a couple for the difference between the goat's milk Brie and the cow's milk Brie that we make is that there's two molds that we added in that are just flavoring molds, and those were both used in France, those were both used in the initial cheese production for Camembert over in France. So it's got a very similar flavor profile to a Camembert, but it's a Brie made with goat's milk. So one of the distinct flavor profiles that you might notice is it's got a little bit of a mushroomy flavor, and that gets especially more distinct as the cheese gets older too. So as far as the production of the Brie goes, it's typically with milk. You know, we receive the milk, it's pasteurized. Then once the milk is cooling, we make sure to extract the milk from the pasteurizer once it's at 100 degrees, because that is the optimal temperature for the cultures in the mold to take the strongest effect on the milk. So that's when the whole cheese process starts, is we add in the cultures, then we'll let it coagulate and ferment into a firm curd. Then we'll cut the curd, then we'll stir it, and then we scoop the curd into molds. So that's like if you've ever seen pictures of a cheese making creamery where they're scooping the curd, like little cubes of white coagulated milk, scooping that into molds, that's what we do with the Brie. And so then it ages for 2 days before being brined, and then it's once it's removed from the molds, it's brined, and then it's put into the aging room for between 2 to 3 weeks for it to grow that thick rind on the outside. And then it gets like it goes from like a fresh, it almost looks like, if you could imagine like a cream cheese, like a wheel of cream cheese, because it's very fresh looking. It doesn't have any rind on it, and it starts out like that in the aging room, but after about 10, 15 days, you'll start to see like a white bloomy fluff that appears, and then that kind of grows into a thicker rind. It's a pretty cool process to see, just like the development of the rind. But sorry if I started kind of just babbling, but
no,
yeah.
You're doing great. Can I jump in and just talk about a couple of things you mentioned?
Yeah, for sure.
The fluff that you just mentioned is great, because I used a term earlier, bloomy rind, right? Why do we call it bloomy rind? Because it fluffs, right? And he's right. It's beautiful. If you've never seen it before, it's a really delicate fluff. You really just want to like sit in a pillow of it, but as soon as you kind of touch it, it collapses. And PC, to define that term, that's Penicillium camberti, correct?
Yeah, that's the one.
Awesome.
There's a couple different PCs, but Camembert is the most typical that you'd find in cheese making for Brie.
Cool. And that's the fluffy white mold, right? And we
both
use the term geotrichum, and that's our wrinkly, or what gives it things that look like a brain sometimes.
Yeah.
That's the mold or fungus that is responsible for that. I believe is it a mold or a yeast? Or I think there's something weird about Geotrichum compared to
Yeah, I couldn't tell you those details, but I usually
Fair
when
enough.
mold and yeast, they're in the same family. They're definitely not.
Great.
As far as
Great.
I don't always know the specifics.
And then Camembert, we both have used this term. So Camembert compared to Brie, coming out of Normandy, right? Just another area in France, another very specific. And Camembert, the big difference is from the consumer side is Camembert is usually a little smaller and a little taller. It's, I think, commonly a 500-gram cheese as opposed to a 2-kilo cheese. And when we talk about the harvest and later we'll talk about a cheese that's very much in that Camembert mold. But I just wanted to define the terms that we're kind of throwing around here. And I thought that was awesome, Sam. Thank you for so much information. Does anybody have questions while we're focused on like cheese making? I see that we're already having some pairing things coming across.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions that have come in real quick. And I don't know, Sam, if you want to cover this one, but how does the taste profile differ between the cow and goat's milk?
Well, yeah, so for the specific breeds that the creamery makes, so I don't know if you guys, so if anyone's in the area, but the brie, so a typical cow's milk brie, I would say, has a very sort of neutral buttery flavor. So it's a pretty, and again, always bries can always vary, but I would say a typical just crowd pleasing brie is going to be one with like an almost cream cheese buttery, just sort of neutral milk flavor, lactic. But with the goat's milk, you get a little bit more funk because usually any goat's milk cheeses are going to have more of like a bitterness and aged sort of funkiness to it. And then in addition, like I mentioned earlier, there's a couple different molds that are used in our goat's milk brie that gives it a nice mushroomy flavor as well. But I think overall, cow's milk, goat's milk has usually a bit more of a tang, a funk, and sort of a bitterness to it for the flavor profile.
Yeah, I think that was all really well said. On that note, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the wine. What I was really blown away was we often get people asking us about, do you try the rind? Do you not try the rind? And, you know, for tonight, we're going to try the rind on everything, but we're going to avoid the wood. That's not rind. That's actually wood. And we'll talk about that a little later. If you like the rind, right? If you don't like rind, we're not sitting here to judge. We just want to enjoy cheese. But I was so blown away that you guys developed rinds that were so flavorful and had the right delicacy, right? Sometimes when it's a little too thick, it's just not fun to chew a rind. But these really offered a whole other flavor component that I thought were great in both cheeses. I actually like the rind of the goat a little bit more because I think it's a little bit more punchy and gives you those more flavors, the bitterness and things that you just mentioned. And I think, you know, I've been seeing a little of the comments. I'm not very good at reading the screen while listening, but I saw Jameson talk about pears and the jam. And that's why these cheeses go so well, is because sure, when you have a real nice crowd pleaser, it's great. But when you have a little bit of bitterness or a little bit of salt, and I can add something like jam or our wines, it just gets so much more complex, so much quicker. And I think that these cheeses are really wine friendly. I was excited by the lineup when I was tasting ahead of you guys earlier. So go ahead, Benji.
Yeah, so Zach, so based on what you just said, you know, Jameson mentioned the pear. He also had mentioned an apple slice with the Robiola as to why is he tasting a stronger flavor when he pairs it with something like an apple or something like this with a pear? What's bringing that extra flavor out?
Yeah, it's totally that conversation of complementary flavors and contrasting. And I think to me, we often talk about how salt isn't just a flavor, it's a flavor enhancer. And something that Will and I talk about a lot, especially really early in the store, is sugar can have a similar effect, right? We have a 70% Trincharis, or we used to. It just got discontinued. Saddest story ever. Will loves that chocolate. And we also had a 90. And for a long time, early days, you could taste both of them next to each other. And you saw that when you added more sugar, it just didn't become sweeter. It became more complex, right? We all like a little salt on our chocolate chip cookie. And I think that the contrast brings out more things. And I think that's, Jameson, what you're experiencing. When you add a little sweet and a little acid in the form of an apple to the Robiola, you get different things. And so I want to go ahead and do our tasting. I'm going to run through the tasting scoring that you guys, a lot of you have heard, as quickly as I can while you guys taste a couple cheeses for me. And then let's talk about the flavors. So go ahead and try the first two cheeses with the white wine if you haven't yet. And I think you'll see different things in the white wine as you taste through all 4 cheeses. So we talk a lot in the past about how red wine sometimes contrasts with goat cheeses in a not nice way. Because we have Lambrusco, it works in a cool way. Lambrusco is really fun and really easy, and it has way less structure and a little residual sweetness. And what that means is it gives license to that bitterness and that funkiness, the mushroom flavors, that with some red wines, if it was too much structure and a really dry red wine, it could be too contrasting. So go ahead and try both wines and the first 2 cheeses, and I'll talk about the scoring that a lot of you have heard real quick. So for those who are new to the tasting, it's -2 to +3, right? Because there's so much flavor dynamic that the language of 1 through 10 just doesn't work. And so the late great Daphne Zeppos taught me this 12 years ago at a Zingerman's Zing train. And I thought it was fascinating, and it's really helped me a lot. So -2 is this idea that the 2 flavors come together and they just contrast. And it's orange juice and brushing your teeth in the morning, right? We've all experienced a -2. You don't have to actually be, we're eating the goat brie right now, but you could be eating anything. And that -2 is the clashing, right? And then the -1 is when I have just one product clash, right? If I was drinking some wine, eating some cheese, and I went back to my wine and all of a sudden it went bad, that's a -1. We're not going to find that tonight. I find sometimes when you drink a red wine, you taste metallic things is when it goes bad. And then a 0, I think, ends up being most food interactions, right? So often we're just not being mindful to the experience, and a lot of food just doesn't interact in a really complex way. A +1 is where something's gotten enhanced, right? Jameson's talking about the apple, to use this example, and I don't know what you experienced, so forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but if the apple tasted kind of whatever, it tasted just like the apple did beforehand, but the robiola got deeper and got more interesting. It gave you more, perfect, +1, right? A +2 is when both things are gonna live, right? And we hope we find +2s tonight. It's where the wine gets a little better, the cheese gets a little better. And so to talk about the first one, right? When I tasted the robiola with the white wine, I got a lot more out of it, but I got specifically more of the acid of the white wine, right? Because I had so much fat, I got more of this like lemon flavors and things like that. When I try it with the goat brie, because the goat brie had mushroom and salt and different things, what I got out of the wine actually was more of the mineral and like the ground the wine came out of, if that makes sense. I know that we don't all maybe think about and dissect flavors as quickly, but if you drink it and you try it with that salty base, you get a totally different expression of the white wine. Me personally, and I thought it was really interesting. And I think if you continue to try the white wine with all of them, you'll see different things. The red wine you'll see maybe doesn't change as profoundly. It just plays nicely with everything. And I think it pulls out those mushroomy notes and savory notes in a really fun way. But it was really interesting seeing how the white wine had a totally different experience with every single cheese. They all work, and I'd be really curious, please say in the chat by the end, which one you liked the most, because I thought it was a really, they all work in a really fun way. What questions do we have? I've been seeing a bunch of stuff coming fast.
There's some questions just based on, you know, if Zingerman's ships and getting some of those goat cheese out there and where it can be found around the country and stuff like that. So Sam's done a good job of kind of getting in the thing.
Awesome.
A lot of people are loving the tastings. We have Lambrusco and goat brie +2. You know, a lot of happiness out there.
And you'll notice when you're trying the Lambrusco, all the fruitiness the Lambrusco brings. So go ahead and add the jam into that experience and see if you can actually pull even more and it becomes even more of a fruit basket in a nice way. I think that we have a lot of really friendly flavors in this basket, more so than when we try a large concept like cheeses of Italy, where we're going to try a lot of different flavors. Because so much is in one wheelhouse, there's a lot of fun to be had and a lot of mixing and matching in a way that we don't usually have. So please keep chatting away and keep telling us what the +2s and 3s our friends should be trying. So I mentioned the +2, and I remember I didn't say +3. A +3 we hope to find tonight, and if someone finds it, the rule is you have to let us all know. A +3 is a flavor that is so delicious. The sum is better than its parts. We've created a new combination. So I always like to call it the peanut butter and jelly effect, right? We very rarely see those things separated because they're so darn good together that it's just this commonly delicious flavor. And we think of those two things as so synonymous because they're so delicious. So if somebody discovers a +3, we all want to hear about it. Cool. Are we ready for some Trillium, friends?
I think people want the triple cream.
People want the triple cream. So, Sam mentioned something, and I meant to actually address it. He said this like friendly, crowd-pleasing brie, and I think that's the greatest way to describe most American bries. Not always the European bries. They get bigger and more of the mushroom. So Trillium, for the longest time, if you came into the store and you asked for a brie, this is all we had, right? We're banking on the idea that you really just want a crowd pleaser. And so triple creams is a term you see a lot, but you probably never really hear it talked about. You just hear it called a brie. Maybe sometimes people say triple cream brie. There's also double creams. The math doesn't work out perfectly. It's really based on the dry weight of the product. So I'm not even prepared to calculate those things. But the reason why a triple cream is a triple cream or a double cream is a double cream is we're adding fat, right? Often in certain cheese recipes, it all comes from milk, right? And we manipulate that milk. We can skim milk to make it leaner, or we can add fat in the form of cream to make it richer. And in this case, we're adding even more fat to the cheese. And so this is when you get to the category where you almost feel like the butter fat just like washes over you. So go ahead and take a bite of Trillium. Let that butter fat wash over you. Trillium is a beautiful cheese coming out of Indianapolis. And it's really cool to be showing, two amazing American cheeses that are coming from those Rust Belt area. I know that we have Vermont and we have Italy, and those are places we would have thought to get cool cheese. But I know that 12 years ago when I started my career, I'm not afraid to say that nothing out of the creamery was as good as this at that time. The creameries had, like I said, had ups and downs, and they've learned so much in the last decade. And I don't know of anything coming out of Indianapolis at that point that was this delicious. Tulip Tree is an amazing company. They are a super group of the cheese world, right? Laura and Fonz both had a 20-year career before they decided to come together and open up Tulip Tree. And they've been around for about 5 years, and they keep winning all these different awards. And they focus on small format cheeses is what they would be called, right? And so some of them are brie, some of them are stinky cheeses like Tiger Lily or Foxglove. That's the other one. And they make a couple other fun cheeses. We really have enjoyed their stuff. They make a fantastic butter that we just brought in. We don't always have it, and it's a wonderful cultured butter, highly cultured. And so they're really celebrating the wonderful dairy, like all of these companies that they have in this area of the Midwest, right? We're so focused on Wisconsin's high quality of milk, Vermont's high quality milk, but we forget the Rust Belt. Michigan to Indiana has really great pastures, right? We are an area known for its grain, and if you can grow grain, you can grow great grass. And so our animals, if they're well fed, and whether it's a blending of grain and grass, there's some really wonderful dairy to come out of this area. Go ahead and try Trillium. It's another bloomy rind cheese. And I want to hear from you guys if you can sense this increase of fat, right? I posed the hypothesis that some people are discussing right now in the food science world. Does fat have its own flavor, right? Does fat get encapsulated by sweetness? Does it get, is it salty? Is it bitter? Is it umami? What is it? Does it have its own thing? Is fat its own thing? And I think when we taste the Trillium, where we have a similar mold profile as the other three cheeses, with that dialed up fat, does anybody perceive it separately? Do you think it's a sixth flavor? I'd love to see in the chat.
We did get a +3 from Tom and
Ooh.
Susan. They said the Trillium with the Lambrusco was a +3 in their mind. And then Zach,
That's awesome.
quick question. We sell both these wines at the store. Are they both available now? Are they?
So the white wine is available right now. The Lambrusco took a little vacation. I tried a different Lambrusco. I always like having Lambrusco in the store because I like having a sweet red. We're pretty much not dry in the sense of no alcohol, but we have a major bias towards anti-sweet products when it comes to alcohol, right? I have a bunch of ciders, bone dry, bunch of beers, bone dry, bunch of wine, bone dry. So we have one sweet white, and I like to have one sweet red for the occasional person who has that preference towards sweet. And Lambrusco also with the bubbles is so food friendly. And so I'm always trying to find my Lambrusco. If 5 people say this is the one we should carry, it'll start going in again, and we'll see how it does. But I tried to switch it up and get like a more esoteric one, and no one bit. So this is not right now available in the store, but it could be if you guys convince me on this call. And then this one, the Union Saker, is certainly available right now. And I don't know if you guys all took a moment to appreciate how cool the label is. I'm just going to take I keep rotating the bottle to try to find the label that we're more used to seeing. This looks a lot more like the back of a label, but if you look through the wine, that's where your your front label is. And it says the name of the wine. It's just a little obscured, or the name of the winery. And I just think it's a beautiful idea.
Jennifer says the Trillium tastes like Kerrygold butter.
Ooh, that's awesome. And even you saying that, Jennifer, it kind of elicits that idea that the 6 flavor is fat, right? If you're tasting the butter, there's so little ingredient difference between a triple cream brie and butter. I mean, there's the mold and things like that, but the fact that you think of it tasting like butter, to me, just really screams that you taste fat as its own flavor. It's an interesting idea. Anybody else? Sam, do you have anything to say about triple creams? Did I describe it correctly if you're still there?
Yeah. So I just love, I like the idea of a triple cream just because it's typically based on my experience that I've had, because I worked before when I was working in more of a large scale dairy production, we made bries and we also made a triple cream, and the triple cream was always a crowd favorite. Just like you compare the two side by side, and everyone would always prefer the triple cream because I would always say it tasted like butter. So that Kerrygold comment kind of made me laugh. But just it's just such I think people love the flavor because it's just got such a higher fat content. But yeah, it is. I was actually just looking up online, just Googling the fat contents. And so triple cream is 70% milk fat versus the butter, which is honestly not far off from butter. Butter is 80% milk fat content. So there's that, and that again, 70 and 80% don't. That's not like nutrition facts label. Once the cheese condenses and the water evaporates, then it's different. But as far as when the content in the milk, it's really not far off from butter as far as the fat content goes for triple cream.
And for both of your bries that you guys are making, are you adding any cream back, or you just milk as the milk comes from the animal?
Yeah, so just because we don't have, so what you would do at a creamery is, if you do want to make a triple cream brie or just a different fat content brie or different fat content cheese, what you would do is you'd standardize the milk. So like you'd separate the fat out of it, so you could separate it to a certain level where, okay, I want X% of milk, X% of fat in the milk, and then you would separate that out with a special machine. Then you would store that fat. And then you would keep that fat to the side. Then you could use that fat to add into another shipment of milk that you get to increase that milk fat content. So say 1 week I want to make a lower fat cheese, then the next week I want to make a higher fat cheese. I could just use the fat taken from last week's milk in this coming week's milk. But we at the creamery, we don't have that kind of equipment just because it's pretty pricey. But we just take the milk as it is. So I would say our brie ranks as just a regular double cream, but yeah, we don't add any additional fat or cream.
Cool. And I want to take a moment to pause on this phrase that Sam just used so like nonchalantly, but it's a really important idea. We just take the milk as it is. Like, very simple idea. And I like that you kind of said it so humbly, but it's amazing, right? Because for anybody who cooks at home a lot, you're cooking something with a recipe that's constantly changing depending on the composition of today's ingredients, right? Milk is not one thing. Milk is mostly water with fat, protein, trace minerals, and all of these things in suspension. It's a really interesting product. And so that variation of the fat content, I mean, wreaks havoc, or maybe not havoc, but really makes you have to react as a cheesemaker at the vat. Is that correct, Sam? I don't want to. I've never made cheese.
I think you're presenting it very well. It is like, I mean, you could definitely do a whole lecture on milk and like the differences in milk and its part in cheese making. But it is really cool just because it's not like the milk you buy at the store. That's always a standard, consistent blend, a composition. But the milk that we get weekly at the creamery, it's always going to be different, especially during the season. It's going to change. And so our cheeses change throughout the season just because the fat content and the protein content in the milks change as the animals eat different grains and different things throughout the different seasons. So it's definitely a really cool idea, really cool thing to think about and kind of like learn more about, is how much the cheesemaker is kind of flexible with the different milk that they receive and what needs to be done to make if you want to make a triple cream brie, but you only have this standard low fat milk, then how do you work with that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And for me as a avid cheese eater, I think that's the excitement of eating small creameries cheeses and seeing those fluctuations. I know in the highest levels of food science, standardization, right? Budweiser is often celebrated for, if I drink a Budweiser anywhere on this planet, it tastes like a Budweiser, right? They have standardized their recipe, even though those ingredients shift depending on where in the world they're brewing Budweiser. And there are cheeses that are that way, and I think that's fun and it has its place. Predictability is a comfort, but I love trying a cheese that changes throughout the year because it's always fun to go back to it, right? You can try this goat brie all year long and get different cheeses all year long. And I think that's like the most beautiful and romantic level of cheese. And that's really what we're looking to capture, a time and a place in the field. But I think that's what it does. On that beautiful idea, let's go to one of the most beautiful American cheeses that exists, Harbison. Harbison last year, 2019 ACS, right? Because 2020 ACS kind of didn't happen. 2019's best of show was Harbison. And Harbison's a cheese, just so you guys know how to cut this, by the way, my favorite way, if you haven't already just started going at the nose, which is fine, is to kind of cut down into the wood and scoop out. And the reason why I like that is because we don't necessarily think of the anatomy of a cheese, but the heart of the cheese is going to taste different than where you're right up against the rind. So I want to get as much of that cross section, taste as much of the cheese at once. You can see Harbison's incredibly ooey gooey and delicious. And so if you ever get the treat of having a whole Harbison, the way to eat it is to cut off the top and dive right into the cheese. The reason why we have that wood bark is because it's so soft. It doesn't stand a prayer of existing on its own without some structural help. And so the wood bark is that structure, right? When you have this really soft young cheese that Sam so well described as like a puck of cream cheese, right? Because they all look very similar when they're in that first stage of infancy. And so they'll take a piece of spruce bark that they've steamed or boiled, so it's sanitary and also flexible, and then they'll put a rubber band to hold it. And as the cheese ages, you can take away the rubber band, and that bark ain't going anywhere because the bark and the cheese become one. And so often when we're talking about wine, chocolate, cheese, you hear this term taste of place, terroir. There's many great books written about the concept. And I think Harbison's one of the best expressions of the idea in America, right? You have a taste of place because the place and the cheese are like together in a real way. Harbison is made by Jasper Hill Cellars, or the Cellars of Jasper Hills. And I think anybody who's eaten a lot of food with us at this point has heard a story about Jasper Hills. But they're just a fantastic creamery. And they're more than just a creamery. So they're making cheese, they're raising animals in different partnerships they have, and their own animals. And then they have the Cellars, right? And the Cellars is this amazing, I think 7-chamber cave that they built in the hillside of their creamery in Greensboro, Vermont. So just like we're about 20 to 40 minutes away from Canada, depending on where you are in Michigan. And you could be a lot farther depending on where you are in Michigan, but they're about 40 minutes away from the Canadian border. up in Vermont. And if we think it's cold, it sounds brutal by their standards sometimes. And, you know, they also have mud season up there, which I have not yet seen with my own eyes, but sounds like it's crazy. Okay, so Vermont, Jasper Hills is aging cheese for small creameries that don't necessarily have the infrastructure to do that kind of stuff and also get to market. And then they're aging their own cheeses. And they also have a wonderful contract with Cabot Creamery, and that's what built the caves. So their caves, I mentioned 7 chambers, right? 3 rooms devoted to cheddaring, or cheddar cheese and Cabot cloth bound, right? And some of their own cheddars that they're making as well, or different experiments from other creameries. I think Shelburne has some cheeses in the Cabot cheddar rooms as well. If you guys remember our cheddar tasting, we talked to Tom from Shelburne Farms. So cheddar is definitely the big thing, and that's the engine that makes the whole thing work. You also have Bloomy Rind mold room, right? All these cheeses would live in the Bloomy room. You have a blue room for Bailey Hazen and Bridgman Blue, as well as their newest idea of native Bailey. And I want to get back to that because I think it's such a cool idea. And then you have an experimental room. And I lost count of how many I've said. So I think it was 7 either way. It's a really amazing place. And Jasper Hills, really since they started, have been agrarian radicalists who are focusing on kind of fixing the Vermont landscape to still continue to have its dairy heritage, right? There are a lot of beautiful parts of this country, and the cities are always kind of encroaching on the beautiful parts. And there's always this discussion and this give and take of the wilderness. But, you know, Vermont's had a dairy heritage that goes back very far. And these guys grew up in the area, and they wanted to see it look similar to what they grew up with when their kids grew up. And so making dairying a viable option is hard, and it's all about value added and making cheeses. And Jasper's really discovered an amazing formula for making cheese, marketing cheese, selling cheese. And so they're helping kind of secure their landscape. They're doing amazing things like building infrastructure with caves. And now they're isolating bacteria, molds, and starter cultures, things that you've heard us talk about in this tasting. But, you know, Sam, once again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. When you buy the molds for most of these things in America, you're going to the same scientific companies that the med schools buy things like Staphylococcus from, right? You're not going to fancy, beautiful artisan cheese companies. You're going to chemical companies in some ways. And so Jasper is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, well, it's all like all the cheese equipment, and like there's the equipment, and then there's also the mold and the cultures, and that all comes from like chemical ingredient companies. And it's all I would say there's only a handful in the world that, you know, people in France, cheesemakers in France and cheesemakers in Spain and cheesemakers in America are buying all the same cultures from the same company, not like local individual places. But yeah, it's
perfect. And so it's fascinating. What Jasper's really trying to do is, can they add more to this catalog, right? Can they isolate the bacteria from cave room number 1 and sell that to Zingerman's to add to their aging room, so to speak, right? And that's totally not the exact way it would work, but that's what they're trying to do, right? And they're developing really cool ideas. They've worked with a Harvard PhD student, Rachel Dutton, I believe is her name. She's fascinating. Heard her lecture a couple times, and they've isolated all sorts of interesting genetic material from the farm and from the flora of the farm. And so Native Bailey is the first time they've made a cheese where they use no commercial starter, no commercial mold. It's all of this self-fulfilling stuff, right? And that's how cheese was made in the beginning, right? You all know of Roquefort. Many of you heard of Roquefort, and Roquefort remains to be Roquefort because it's made in one cave. It's one cave divided by everybody who makes Roquefort because the cave is part of the ingredients, right? I can't make Roquefort in a different cave and get the same product. Even if you sold me the Penicillium roqueforti, there's still something that's not recreatable. And so what they're trying to do is kind of bottle their ingredients that they get in that flora and kind of do that work of isolating. And, you know, maybe in 10, 20 years, when you're a small creamery and you're starting up, you can be like, I want Bailey blue molds, and I want a little Harbison cultures, and I want some of this, and it can be the building blocks of the next generation of creameries. So it's just beautiful that they're always, throughout their history, thinking in such a grand way, well beyond the scope of their creamery, really trying to affect the whole industry. So hats off to Mateo and his team. We always love their stuff. And Harbison is an amazing cheese. What did you guys all think? It's one of Will's favorite cheeses. There's so many layers in this cheese. I'd love to hear about pairings and thoughts that people have had.
One other cool comment about Jasper Hill that I know of is that so a big thing, like I mentioned before, is that the cheese flavors, like the milk always changes seasonally, just because the what the cows or what the animals graze on isn't available at the same time throughout the year. So it's the grass they're eating in the summer is going to be different than the grass in the fall, and then there's no grass in the winter. So then the milk dramatically changes, because usually they go from like fresh grass, natural grass, to like grains or packaged So like one thing that Jasper Hill does to get a more continuous flavor in their milk is that they built this huge barn, and they invested a lot of money to make sure that they could have this hay and this natural foraging available all year round. So, and it's definitely, it's a very unique idea in the cheese making world, just because it is a lot of investment for what might not be, well, but it depends on who you ask, but maybe it might not be like a huge return. But I mean, after they did this, 15, 20 years ago, now everyone's looking at them like, oh, that's genius. That's so great that now they have this beautiful like summer flavor throughout the year. Because it's typically known that like the fall cheeses are going to be the best cheeses because they have fresh summer foliage. But now Jasper Hill invested in to where they have the infrastructure where they can have this fresh summer foliage available all year round. So that's really cool.
Awesome. And I saw Barb suggested a little bit of the fig jam with that Harbison. It is so complex, and the fig, that deep, dark kind of figgy notes, will bring out more complexity, I think, even more, because you're adding sugar to it. What other flavors do people like, Benji?
People are definitely loving on it. Will said he would trade his kids for a lifetime supply of Harbison, so that offer is on the table for anyone interested. There was also a question from Dave and Brittany. Isn't one of the challenges their scale in the GRAS process?
What?
Says, isn't one of the challenges their scale in the GRAS process, for what you were talking about a few minutes ago?
So when you're working with bacteria, Will, or Zach, the challenge is that the bacteria has to be generally recognized as safe. So you have to go through the process to get the bacteria that you're using. If you're using a culture from someone else's, or if you're mixing cultures, it has to pass the FDA generally recognized as safe food processing process. So you can't just take someone else. You can't take two people's bacteria, merge them together without going through a certification for that new cheese manufacture process.
I see. I understand. Yeah, it's certainly part of it. And I can tell you that this project that resulted in Native Bailey just coming out just now, we have wheels of Native Bailey right now. So you can buy a Bailey Hazen and Native Bailey Hazen if you call the store and see what the differences are. And that process, when I was at Jasper visiting 6 years ago, they weren't just starting it then. They were showing off how far they'd come. So I think that this project is probably over a decade old. Rachel, the first time I heard her name and she was in graduate school was at least a decade ago. And so they have things like a DNA sequencer in order to isolate what's in it, to your point, to do this proof. And, you as a scientist know a lot more than I do about that. But it's wild. There's really, to your point, you can't just bottle bacteria and be like, here, put this in your cheese and distribute it to the masses. And so they've had a huge process to get that going. And I'm sure they're not at a point yet where they can sell it to the next guy. But this was the first kind of commercially available experiment, if you will, that they've had. And in terms of tasting notes, a couple people who've tasted it so far, I just thought the flavors were electric. There's maybe a touch more salt in the native one, and Will and I both think that that's part of it, but all the flavors that do exist are just bigger, right? I thought of electricity skidding across water while I was eating it. It's there. It's a punchy version of itself, but it's a really cool experiment.
Another question, Zach. How did the baked brie become so popular in kind of grocery stores and kind of the marketing of it?
Yeah, I think the baked brie and why it's so beloved is because um, bries have a ripening curve, and if you bake it, and nothing matters, right? And so let's look at the 4 cheeses on you know, my counter, and I imagine we probably changed batches here and there between your cheeses, but they should all look about the same, right? So you see this one's just, it's totally gone, and it's beautiful. This cheese, you see there's a little center part where it's almost like a firm hockey puck, right? Hockey puck being an overstatement, but you see the puck, you see the firmness, right? And in Trillium, you see a lot of that center where it hasn't fully ripened. And in Harbison, we're back to fully. And if I bake a brie, it does not matter where my brie was in ripeness. It's going to be melty when I pull it out. And so when you're making these cheeses from Sam and Aaron's and everybody's point of view at the creamery, they have such a small window to get everything right. Sam, how many days from make until the end of this cheese's life, give or take a week or two? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so we receive the milk on Tuesdays, and it's typically in the aging room by Friday. It's in the aging room by Friday, and then it is in the aging room for about 2 weeks, between 2 and 3 weeks. So I would say it's from the day that we receive it, from the day the milk's pasteurized, I would say that it's going to be packaged at 21 days.
Okay.
But the thing is, it's packaged at 21 days, but you could buy it and it would be, the brie that you would see, but it'd be a lot firmer and it would have a very like a sour, well, not terribly sour, but it would have like a lactic milky taste that typically is like, it's for a young brie, it would be very milky, a little bit sour. We wrap it at 3 weeks, but I say we sell it at 5 weeks.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. So he gets 3 weeks till he wraps it. I want 3 weeks on my counter before it's, something I'm like, you need to eat this tonight and I'll give it to you half off, right? There's that whole life. It's only about 6 to 8 weeks of this cheese's existence, right? And so if you're a giant cheese company and you're just selling cheese and it doesn't matter, and then you're a really big grocery store where no one's sitting there pinching the cheese to see if they're ripe and they're not turning over their inventory very quickly, you're going to buy a lot of hockey pucks. You're going to buy a lot of ripe bries that haven't fully ripened. And, if you like the tangier flavors, great, that's the cheese you like. But if you want the full experience, you want the cheeses that are fully liquefying in some ways. And we can go into what that's about if anybody wants to understand those textures. But if you're baking a brie, you're kind of neutralizing any of this. You're standardizing the texture. You're forcing it to ripen. And then the jam is the same reason everybody enjoys the triple berry or the fig jam or the apple with all these flavors, is because I've added sweetness. And so baked bries are delicious. And any of these cheeses would work for that. But I also think that our cheeses are so delicious that it's so important to try them on their own and to save baked bries for, whatever brie you find around the house.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, Zach, because I think brie and jam put in the oven is delicious. I could eat a whole one with like a whole spread out with jam. I could eat a whole brie, but I always hate to do that with a nice one like a Trillium or like a more expensive cheese that you buy from a local creamery. I always hate to mask it with something with another flavor, just because the flavor combination will be delicious, but I also just want to enjoy the cheese just for the cheese itself. But yeah, so I think you can find like a supermarket brie, spread that with some sherry strawberry jam, put it in the oven, and it's delicious. But I typically wouldn't do that for a smaller local creamery brie.
And if you did, let's say, buy a brie and you're like, well, this is just not ripe enough for me to enjoy, I think the answer that still satisfies Sam and I is maybe heat it up a little bit, but don't cover it with the crust. Don't cover it with the jam. You'll see silly like fondue-esque recipes, which are really just putting a cheese in an earthen, in something that's oven safe and throwing it in the oven. And if you have guests coming in 10 minutes and your cheese is just not ripe enough, maybe that's the trick, but that's not mask it if it's a really nice creamery with all those other things. Let your guests make their own little jam and cracker combo.
We do have a question here from Jameson. So he's tried Brie's and omelets. It's just not the right cheese. Have you found a good grilled Brie cheese? Any bread recommendations or jams that would go well with it, or just generally cooking with Brie?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jameson. And I think it's because of some of the dairy science we're alluding to, is that, these cheeses have gone through a process called proteolysis, I believe. Sam, please correct me if I'm wrong, where we've eaten the proteins and we are left with the lipids, which is why it's doing this. And I think, thank you. And I think part of the reason, Jameson, it doesn't work is because all you're left with is that sixth flavor that we keep talking about. You just have fat that you've added to your eggs or your meal, and you wanted more. You wanted salt, you wanted protein, you wanted things that are beyond just the scope of fat flavors. And so I think that is why the Brie isn't satisfying those needs. And I think that Brie can be great when I'm doing something where I can introduce acid and complexity in other ways, such as the baked Brie being so tasty, or cooking it and making my own little sandwiches if I wanted to. You also think of like the Brie olive tapenade kind of classic French baguette sandwich with a little arugula, right? You see more cold Brie and apple sandwiches. You see more cold Brie applications. I think because the heat just kind of destroys the delicacy of it, or the delicateness of it. Oh, Brie and turkey. That's a good call. I like that sandwich. What other questions are we seeing? Are we ready for chocolate time?
Barbara says she tastes a hint of sage in the Harbison as well.
Yeah, and that's that spruce note. I think that's the woodiness that you're tasting. It's a great tasting note with the sage. I love that. And I think that if you were cooking, if you chose to cook with Harbison, or if you were doing this fondue-esque experience, I think you can play with that, right? If you chose to play that up by using rosemary crackers, it's going to just accentuate those flavors. A cheesemonger who no longer is with us, who I used to compete with, and I missed it dearly. I saw him present Harbison, and the coolest thing maybe I ever saw at CMI, at the Cheesemonger Invitational. And he created a tea light setup with a Harbison on top and a little tea light down low, cut the top of the Harbison off, and it created this little like fondue pot inside its own cheese. And it was, I've never recreated it since I got to taste it that night, but it's something I think about often. And I encourage anybody to do the tea light Harbison fondue pot, and then get a little like warm sage on the plate, or get rosemary crackers. If you like those notes, you can really play them up.
Perfect. I think it's time for some chocolate.
Time for chocolate? Okay. So you guys, we have Pump Street chocolates. You have various Pump Streets depending on what chocolate you got in your bag. Pump Street's a really cool brand, and the first time I had ever heard of them was when Will did his initial chocolate buy, when we first got our big sample pack, which was a very exciting day not many years ago, but 4 years ago. We got well over 15 chocolates that day. I think it was just about 20, and we were tasting and trying things, and we knew very little about the different producers. We knew a fair amount about chocolate, especially Will, but we hadn't yet met our friends, if you will. And Pump Street, it was love at first sight. So Pump Street's an amazing producer out of the UK, out of Suffolk, England, and they were bakers before they were chocolate makers. And so some of their bars utilized their talents in baking, but they were craftsmen, right? They understood how to make a really delicious product with an inconsistent ingredient, right? Because bread is very similar to milk in the sense that the protein content of the flour and things like that can fluctuate, especially if you're milling your own grain, and the air quality and the humidity in the air changes the moisture content. I had a semester of baking when I was in college, and it was so informative to how much is going on in a good bakery. And so they've learned a lot about kind of working with environment and what the ingredients have to offer at any given time. And they're able to take that proficiency and apply it to chocolate. Mongers is really focused on chocolate, cheese, charcuterie. Those are our three pillars, if you will. And chocolate's, I think, near and dear to all of our hearts because it's allowed us to explore so much more of the world than I ever thought we would before. Chocolate comes between this really narrowed span of 20 degrees north or south of the equator. And so much of the history of chocolate's been kind of poorly told. I like to remind everybody, if I asked everybody who maybe didn't know Mongers before, or a year ago, 2 years ago when you were kids, what's your favorite chocolate? Somebody's going to say Hershey's, somebody's going to say Swiss, someone's going to say Belgian, German, and all of those answers are perfectly fine answers. But what I want to bring to mind is the fact that there's not a cocoa pod growing in any of those places, right? There's a story we have not told. So Hershey's, fine, you like Hershey's. Where is Hershey's getting their chocolate from, right? If you like Swiss chocolate, great. Where is the Swiss chocolate coming from? And so there's been a movement over the last 20, 30 years of discovering where the chocolate's from and, you know, giving it the same respect as we do with wine. What's the terroir of that chocolate? What is the taste of place? What does it matter if my chocolate's from Jamaica, which maybe some of you have, Ecuador, which a lot of you I bet have because they have it in a couple bars, Madagascar, maybe some of you have. What is the difference? What does the chocolate change based on those environments? And it's just like Sam and I were talking earlier about the difference in the fluctuation of milks. The cocoa is going to have different properties depending on where it's grown, what altitude, so on and so forth. So we've loved exploring chocolate, but we really like explaining kind of the ethics behind chocolate and why asking the question of where it comes from is really important. And so if what you land on is fair trade chocolate, that's great. But for us, that's the beginning of the conversation. And we want to only go up from fair trade to things like direct trade, right? Fair trade's its own organization, just like USDA certified organic. And that means that somebody has to get paid to keep that license going and that office running. And that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with fair trade. We're very thankful that it exists. And I think it's a great stepping stone for most people who've never even thought about where things come from. But if you can get beyond fair trade and go to direct trade, right? If you can actually meet the people or have trusted relationships that help you make these decisions, you're in a really good space. So while Will and I have not had the pleasure of visiting all of our chocolate producers, Will has visited Maru in Vietnam, and he has been to Ritual in Park City. And we get to visit these friends when we go to things like the Fancy Food Show. And, you know, we rely on the relationships they have with some of these really amazing chocolate sourcing and infrastructure that started to exist throughout the world. And so we see similar names showing up over and over. So for instance, this one from the Jamaica bar is coming from Bachelor's Hall Estate, and people like Dick Taylor. I'm actually looking at a Dick Taylor bar right now from that same source. And so there's really growing networks similar like we talked about in Jasper, where they're building an infrastructure where chocolate can just be better for everybody. And so we've been so energized by teaching about chocolate and kind of going on our own journey discovering chocolate. And I hope you guys have been enjoying it with us. You know, Mongers at this point has the largest selection of bean-to-bar chocolate in the state of Michigan. So if any of what I just said entices you, or if you really want to make sure you're buying chocolate that had no chance of slave labor or child labor being involved in it, you can make that really great conscious decision by buying chocolate with us. And you can try chocolate from, you know, 25, 30 different cacao growing regions and taste what's the difference between Ecuador, Madagascar, Vietnam, or what's the difference between this part of South Vietnam and that part, left side and right side of the Mekong Delta. So our chocolate selection is a really fun part of our store. I have the sourdough bar, so I'm going to enjoy a little crunch with my chocolate.
Speaking of the sourdough bar, Crystal says she has the sourdough and sea salt, and it tastes like peanut butter toast to her, which is, let's say, aces.
And I think that I want to encourage you guys to go ahead and add chocolate to your cheese, right? These are all cheeses that, whether milk or dark chocolate, go really well with chocolate because they're so mild. We talked a lot about how it's mostly fat and salt that we're playing with. And so these are great cheeses to go ahead. I bet all four of them would give you different response with your chocolate.
Speaking of which, you know, Jameson said the Harbison with his chocolate was a +2. He also asked, how does one actually get to the Fancy Food Show like yourself?
So Fancy Food Show happens in New York and in San Francisco in normal years, right? Let's put away the pandemic for a second in that regard. It's, I think, the last week of July every summer at the Javits Center in New York, and it's at the Moscone Center in MLK week in San Francisco. And it's a really, it's a fun conference to go to. I always, whenever my friends are like, oh, I have to go to a work conference, I'm like, you get to see all your friends and eat and drink. And they're like, no, I work in like steel. What are you talking about? For us, we love our work conferences. So the Fancy Food Show is open to the public. And it's like somewhat cheaper if you have a membership to the Specialty Food Association, but you can totally go as a regular person, as long as you get to one of those cities and wander and see as much unfancy food as there is fancy food. It's a funny selection of stuff. There's a lot of different jerky products and things that we don't necessarily get excited about, but there's also a lot of our friends there. And then the other big conference that we attend every year, at least for cheese, is the American Cheese Society Conference. I try to go every couple of years, and that's at a different city every year. So it was supposed to be in Portland before all this craziness, and this coming year it's going to be in Iowa. So we're really excited to go visit our friends in Iowa.
Jameson, I will say that it sounds great at the outset, and then like halfway through the second day, you have to start. Really, the first day is when it happens, but you've got to start exercising a lot of self-control, because there's free samples everywhere. And you're like, oh, yeah, I'll have some pretzels. And then someone's offering you like some kombucha. And then there's, pad thai. And you just like walk down an aisle. And then sometime around 10:30, you're like, I don't want to eat anything else all day. And then you get to the booth where you actually need to sample the product that like you buy, and you don't want to try any of it. So there's definitely there's an art to it. And then after the event, every night, there's usually industry parties where people try to feed you more. And everybody's just sitting around attempting, not to throw up at the restaurant that they've been invited to where they can eat for free. But if you want to fly us to New York next time it happens, we'll get you a free ticket, on Mongers. We'll walk around and we'll do the best we can to not completely gorge ourselves into oblivion.
I make no promises about not gorging myself, but you'll have a good time. And Will's right. It's a marathon for eating. It's really, it's intense. And yeah, last year was a total, it was a lot of fun, a lot of food. What other questions do we have, friends?
Nothing right now. Looks like
Nothing?
What events do we have coming up, Zach?
Ooh, you expect me to remember that? I'm sure. We have an Oktoberfest coming up next week, I believe. We're really excited. We haven't done beer in a tasting since Father's Day, if I recall. So we're going to explore Oktoberfest. Oktoberfest is going to be a little format change beyond the beer. There's also going to be charcuterie built into the box. So cheese, meat, chocolate, and beer. And that's going to be a fun celebration of the season and the fun fall flavors that are coming around. Speaking of fall flavors, we were really excited to just participate in a panel discussion for Pure Michigan IPA from Short's Brewery. So if anybody wants to see us in a different format, kind of talking with some other industry professionals, we got to do a cheese pairing with them, and Joe Short was on it. So I did that last night. Do we have any other public tastings that are already scheduled, gang? Will, Benji?
Nothing scheduled right now, but we know they're in the works. I'm sure we'll schedule them probably Monday when we all chat next.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of fun stuff as we gear up for the holidays. This is a fun time of year, so things like Rogue River Blue are in town. Our special batch of Pleasant Ridge Reserve. Will has a bunch of fun chocolates that are going to start arriving, and I have a bunch of fun cheeses. So in the next 4 to 6 weeks, some of the greatest things of our year will come in, and they only come but once a year for a lot of these. A lot of these are orders that we set in July. So July is a weird time of year. And Will, I hear that you were about to say something. What else do we have going on?
Oh, I was just going to say we've got Rogue River Blue back in. We just got it the other week. We got a pretty good amount of it. If none of you have ever tried it, it's what I choose for my birthday cake every year if I can. Just a big wedge of Rogue River Blue and a candle, and that'll do the trick. It is an insanely good cheese. The 2 next public tastings that we've been conceiving of are likely other deep dives. So probably a washed rind tasting. So think stinky cheese, and potentially a blue. We are gonna have some trouble slotting them in to our calendar right now because we're being inundated with requests for these events for private organizations, and the pace at which we're booking them is quite rapid. But we're gonna try to get in, one or two more before the end of the year.
We also mentioned potential pre-recorded ones so we can get everyone their own holiday flavor.
Yeah, which would be a cool way to send a gift, where we have a kit, and then it's not a scheduled event necessarily, but you send a kit to someone, they get a YouTube link, and they can log on and watch at their own leisure.
So one quick question that came in, and I'm not sure, have you had Fleischkäse? Or
No, I'm not familiar with Fleischkäse.
Does it mean flesh cheese?
we'll have to see if Tom and Susan can give a little bit more information on it.
Yeah, basically it's sold in Germany. I lived in Germany for a long time, and we'd go down the walk plazas where they had all the baker and butcher and cheese shops. And Fleischkäse was a blended meat and cheese blend that looked like bologna, and they would serve it hot on a brötchen with mustard. And it's just phenomenal. It really is. You would taste whatever cheese they put in there, and of course the meat, and it was just something because it was a cheese blend.
That sounds better than what I was thinking it was, which was some sort of like horrendously overripe cheese that just tastes like dead body, that reminds people of corpses.
This was a quick sandwich. I mean, you'd be kind of hungry. You go into a butcher shop, you say, wie viel kostet das eine Fleischkäse? And they go like, 2 marks, and they give you a brötchen with mustard in it and the Fleischkäse, and you just walk out and have your little, and you weren't hungry anymore.
It sounds awesome. I want that.
We'll have to give it a try.
Maybe it's the next Mongers project is making our own Fleischkäse.
If you got the rabbit and pork cheek terrine that we sell, and then put that in a Vitamix with a little bit of cheddar, it sounds like you might.
No kidding.
Something.
They would case it like a big, huge 5-inch bologna, and it would be hot, and they'd cut it in like 3/4-inch slices and put it between the bread. So you were getting a pretty good serving.
It sounds like a better version of a Philly cheesesteak to me.
Amen.
Could be. Yeah.
Amen. I love that. Well, friends, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to take this moment to say thank you to everybody. We've been so appreciative of all the support we've gotten from you guys with all these tastings, and we've loved and learned a lot through them. And so thank you so much for being here tonight. Please let us know what else you guys want to deep dive into. If you guys want to shoot up in the chat, if you guys would go to a blue cheese or a stinky cheese tasting, that information is always really helpful for us. But keep letting us know what you guys want to explore. We're so appreciative. And like I always say, if you guys keep showing up, we're going to keep doing what we do. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. It's been such a fun experience to kind of taste with you and learn with you and grow with you guys. So thank you.